Today, I want to talk about, and we will go through an important book that I believe that all Americans should cherish and read. I mean, whether you are a religious or irreligious person, whether you believe in God or not. The book that I would suggest, and we will go through, maybe even through episodes, because I believe many people will learn and get educated through it. The book is written by, is one of my favorite guys, to be honest with you, Dan Barker, or Daniel Barker. The author, he's more famous for the book Godless, but the book we are talking about today is called or titled God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. And the book is really interesting because it's full of citations, and it also tells us so much about different opinions, arguments, debates about the Bible and the God of the Bible. I hope you enjoyed this journey with me. So Daniel Barker was a Christian preacher and a minister for 19 years before leaving Christianity in 1984. He's the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation with his wife, Annie Laurie Gaylor, and is the author of several books, including his memoir, Godless: How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists, published by Ulysses Press. He lives in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's very important here to point out that his book, it is forwarded by Richard Dawkins, who is an English ethologist, evolutionary biologist, and writer. He is an emeritus fellow of the New College, Oxford, and was the University Oxford's professor for public understanding of science from 1995 until 2008. He is the author of several New York Times best-selling books, including The Selfish Gene, Oxford University Press, and The Blind Watchmaker, published by Norton Co. And The God Delusion, it's another famous book. So Dan Barker has written other books, but right now we will go through this important book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. So Richard Dawkins, in his foreword for the book, describes the God of the Bible to be the most hated villain in all fiction, using the following terms in describing him. So he says that, quotation, irredeemably nasty, as to combine all the following: jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. And Dawkins adds in his forwarding of the book that what will the apologists say in response? He asked, the Bible was never meant to be taken literally, wasn't it? Did the generations upon generations of scribes faithful reproducing the story of Adam and Eve and the talking snake not take it literally? Really? Were the pious generation of churchgoers through the Dark and Middle Ages theologically sophisticated to realize it was all a metaphor? Really? When the peasants mustered to defy Richard II and sang, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was the gentleman? And they mutter apophatically under their breath that, of course, it was never meant to be taken literally. Don't be so ridiculous. Even today, more than 40% of Americans think the world began exactly in the way Genesis describes it, less than 10,000 years ago. Also, Dawkins says, but anyway, if not literally, how else might our apologists wish to interpret the Bible? As a set of moral tales? A handy guide to what's right and wrong? What moral tales? You cannot be serious. Read this book. So he suggests that you should read this book in order to get answers for these questions. And Dawkins then assumes that some adherents of the Bible might come up with the following positive attributes as to challenge the 19 ugly terms he chose to describe the God of the Bible. He challenges them to find verses that fit the following attributes. The God of the Old Testament is, here we go, so magnanimous, generous, encouraging, forgiving, charitable, loving, friendly, good-humored, supportive of women, of homosexuals, of children, freedom-loving, open-minded, broad-minded, non-violent, and go on. Try and find those nice verses. Do your best, Dawkins says. You think you will succeed? That's his question. So then Dan Barker explains in his foreword how Dawkins contributed with him in composing the book and the way it works by saying, needless to say, that renowned sentence has been highly controversial. In order to answer his critiques, Richard asked me to help him gather biblical citations. His original plan was a keynote spider diagram. The body of the spider would be the beginning of the sentence, and each of the 19 legs would be labeled one of the theistic attributes. Clicking on ethnic cleanser, for example, and I believe he's referring to an electronic copy of the book here, would bring up, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, for I have given you the land to possess. Or Numbers chapter 33, verses 52 to 53, followed by more Old Testament verses. As I was sending the compilations it became clear that the lengthy list would overwhelm a simple slide. End of quotation. Thus, each spider of these would become a chapter that people will find out when they read the book. And Dan Barker admits that he is not a professional Bible scholar, but and that as a Christian he used to consult the Bible as an evangelist pastor. But he argues back that he does know much enough to support and defend arguments, and that he is not shy of consulting experts before going to his debates. And Mr. Barker says, that is the purpose of this book. If you have never read the Bible, you might like to know what is in it. If you are a believer, you should be happy to see us promoting Bible reading. As a former clergyman, let me offer some counsel. Don't take the word of your pastor, rabbi, or priest. My hope is that you will do what Richard Dawkins has done and simply read the Bible for yourself. End of quotation. Later, we will see some of these stories, of course, that Dan Barker provides, and also see their implications. And he states, or he says, at the National Prayer Breakfast on February 6, 2015 in Washington, D.C., President Barack Obama said, and he's quoting President Obama, "No God condones terror." He claimed that Islamic State is, in quotation, warping religion. As people of faith, we are summoned to push back against those who try to distort our religion, any religion, for their own nihilistic ends. End of quotation. But in the Bible, Obama's own deity actually uses the word terror to describe his intentions. A terror from God fell upon the cities. I will send my terror in front of you. I will bring a terror on you, all the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel. KJV. Hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord. The terror of God are arrayed against me. I was in terror of calamity from God. They shall be in great terror, for God is with company of the righteous, and I will make them an object of terror and of plunder. And Dan Barker later says that some Christians, or those who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, say that, but you are taking it out of context. And Dan Barker replies back saying that many biblical inerrantists tell me that if I would situate those harsh Old Testament passages within a broader picture, I would see that God is overall truly good, like a loving but stern parent. They think the Bible is an intact and coherent book, a unitary Word of God that explains itself harmoniously no matter which author you are reading. A verse or two might seem shockingly immoral close up, but stepping back, we can see God's grander plan and know that although he is uncompromising in his holiness, he is actually a wise, wonderful, merciful, forgiving Father. So he is, Dan Barker is trying to show you the point of view where Christians try to argue back their own argument. And he then explains that the irony in such logic, is that, and I'm quoting here, when I ask those believers to give me the context of a troublesome passage, they often produce a verse from another part of the Bible, sometimes written centuries later in another language and country with a different agenda, such as, whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, written in Greek around the year 100 CE, rather than seeing the rebuttal verse as a contradictory and anachronistic. They pretend that it explains and justifies the crime against humanity they are trying to excuse. I have presented, Dan says, more than 1,500 horrific passages in this book, often describing the context and the Hebrew words. But if a believer can find one or two selections by another author claiming God is not like that, somehow I am the one taking it out of context. And here I would like to add a point to what Daniel Barker says, and that is, whenever I hear such a defense, and it is important to know here that the context excuse actually works the other way around, meaning that the context apology applies to human experiences rather than being a given explanation to some problematic passages in the Bible, since humans are limited to what they experience and what they know, whereas God should have given a perfect answer or perfect answers that are useful and helpful for all ages, not just to pre-modern era, not for pre-modern eras. And Dan replies also to those who argue that the Old Testament has a frequent mention of the word love, by saying the word love occurs in the Old Testament about 400 times, but most of those are top-down, God telling his people that he loves them or commanding them to love him. Love is almost always connected with obedience and ownership in the Bible. It is a possessive one-way dynamic, like a master demanding total devotion from his slaves, or a husband requiring his wife to be submissive and adoring. God's love is exclusive. He cherishes his chosen people only. God's love is conditional, and he cares only for those who keep his commandments. Very rarely do we see any Israelite declaring that they love God. The psalmist, usually identified as the genocidal King David, twice said he loved God. Psalm 18 verse 1 and 116 verse 1. And the author of the First Kings tells us that King Solomon loved the Lord by burning 1,000 animals on an altar. Our 1 Kings chapter 3 verses 3 to 4. Solomon also loved 700 wives and 300 concubines, and his love for God did not stop him from worshiping idols and ultimately tearing the kingdom apart. It is clear those people did not love, in quotation marks, their God in any normal human understanding of the word. Also, later Dan Barker adds that I need to head off any gotcha readers who think that since Dawkins and I are criticizing God, we must be agreeing that he exists. I hear this all the time, but the title of this book is God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. The word fiction is right on the cover. As you read the following pages where I write, God said this or God did that, don't imagine I am treating an invented character as a real person. I have faced similar arguments in both the real life and on social media, like Facebook and Twitter, where people love to say that I talk about God more than believers do, and usually I answer them by this. Because lies and made up stories can sound okay and real, therefore we need to talk about them, expose them, and show how faulty they are. So the God idea is something that we should be aware of, its hazardous nature. So talking too much about God or so much about God, it doesn't mean that you believe in God. No, actually, it means the opposite. It means it is a big problem. And so Dan goes and discusses several fictitious literary characters that are considered villains, and he compares them to the Old Testament God as to see which side will win the title villain. But of course, God wins the title of the contests. Then Dan says, what about Satan? Most Bible believers think that the devil is the personification of evil. But what were his actual deeds? Count them. You can show the number of his victims on your fingers. Satan in the Bible murdered only 10 people, and even this was accomplished only with the direct authority and approval of God. Poor Satan gets all the blame and none of the respective desires. Is it any wonder that the legal term for unpredictable, uncontrollable, and destructive events is not act of Satan, but act of God? At the end of his introduction, and after quoting various people from Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Mark Twain, and others, he finalizes it after quoting Christopher Hitchens by saying, Hitchens was careful to state that organized religion should have a great deal on its conscience. He recognized, as Dawkins does, that in spite of their terrific holy books, most individual believers are nicer than God. They have risen above the brutality of the Bible. This book illustrates what we have risen above. And I think that is a very powerful ending of the introduction. So, see you next time with another episode of Dan Barker's God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction.